The old clock on the wall showed 6 in the evening when David wiped his hands on the dirty cloth for what felt like the 100th time that day. His small repair shop sat on the corner of Pine Street, squeezed between a laundromat and a grocery store that had seen better days. The paint on his shop's walls was peeling, and the sign outside flickered sometimes, but it was his place and he was proud of it. David had been fixing cars for 15 years now. He learned everything from his father, who taught him that honest work was the best work. Every morning he would unlock the heavy metal door, switch on the lights, and get ready for whatever broken cars people would bring him. Some days were good, some days were not so good. Today was one of those not-so-good days. He looked at the stack of papers on his desk. Bills, bills, and more bills. The electric company wanted their money. The parts supplier was asking for payment. His landlord, Mr. Peterson, had already been patient with him twice this month. David counted the money in his cash box. It was not enough. It was never enough these days. The problem was simple. People in his neighborhood did not have much money. When their cars broke down, they had to choose between fixing their car or buying food for their family. David understood this. He grew up in the same neighborhood. He knew what it was like to count every dollar. That is why he never charged too much. When Mrs. Johnson brought her old Honda with a strange noise, he only charged her for the part, not for his time. When young Tommy needed his car fixed to get to his new job, David let him pay in small amounts every week. Other shop owners called him crazy. They said he would never make money that way. Maybe they were right, but David slept well at night. The big shops across town were different. They had shiny floors, new equipment, and fancy computers. They charged 3 times what David charged, and somehow people paid it. David could not understand why. Maybe it was the fancy waiting room with free coffee. Maybe people thought expensive meant better. But David knew something those big shops did not know. He knew every customer's name. He knew their stories. He knew their cars almost as well as they did. David's shop was not fancy, but it was real. The walls were covered with thank you cards from customers. There was a picture of Mrs. Garcia's wedding day, because David fixed her car just in time for her to get to the church. There was a drawing from little Annie, whose mom's car David fixed for free when she lost her job. These things meant more to David than any fancy equipment. But today, looking at those bills, David felt worried. Really worried. He had been putting off some of his own bills to help his customers. The problem was getting bigger every month. His old equipment was breaking down and he could not afford to replace it. Some days he worked on cars with tools that were older than some of his customers. David's phone had been quiet all day. Only 2 customers came in. Mr. Brown needed an oil change and Lisa needed her windshield wipers replaced. Simple jobs that did not pay much. David was grateful for any work, but he needed more to keep the shop open. He walked around his shop, turning off lights to save money on electricity. The concrete floor was stained with years of oil and grease. His workbench was covered with old parts and tools that had been with him since the beginning. Everything in the shop told a story. The dent in the wall from when he accidentally backed a car too far. The coffee stain on his desk from the morning he was so tired he knocked over his cup. This was his life's work. This little shop represented everything he believed in. Fair prices, honest work, and treating people right. But believing in something did not pay the bills. David sat down in his old chair and rubbed his eyes. He was tired. Not just tired from working, but tired from worrying about money all the time. The rain started falling outside. David could hear it hitting the metal roof of his shop. Rain meant people would drive more carefully. That meant fewer accidents and fewer cars to fix. It also meant people would stay home instead of bringing their cars in for small repairs they had been putting off. David looked at the calendar on his wall. Tomorrow was Wednesday. Rent was due on Friday. He had some money, but not enough. Maybe he could call Mr. Peterson and ask for a few more days. Maybe someone would bring in a big job tomorrow. Maybe things would get better. But deep down, David knew he was in trouble. Real trouble. The kind of trouble that kept him awake at night, staring at the ceiling and wondering how he was going to keep his dream alive. He had thought about getting a job at one of the big shops, but he could not imagine working for someone else. This shop was not just his business. It was his home, his identity, his contribution to the community. David stood up and walked to the window. The street was empty except for a few cars driving slowly through the rain. The lights from the grocery store next door reflected off the wet pavement. This neighborhood was not fancy, but it was full of good people, working people, people who needed someone like David, someone who would not take advantage of them when their car broke down. He thought about his customers, people like Robert, who drove a taxi to support his 3 kids. When Robert's car had transmission trouble, David fixed it and let him pay over 6 months. Without his car, Robert could not work. Without work, his family would struggle. David could not let that happen. There was also Helen, an elderly lady who depended on her car to get to doctor appointments. When her car would not start one winter morning, David dropped everything and went to her house to fix it. He never charged her for the house call. Helen always brought him homemade cookies after that. These were the people David worked for. Not for the money, though he needed that too. He worked for the feeling he got when he solved someone's problem. When he got their car running again and saw the relief on their face. When he saved them money they could not afford to spend. When he gave them back their independence and mobility. The phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. David looked at the old black phone on his desk. It was probably another bill collector. He almost did not answer it. But something made him pick it up. Maybe it was hope. Maybe it was just habit. "Hello, Dave's Auto Repair," he said, trying to sound more cheerful than he felt. The voice on the other end was familiar. It was Rosa, a nurse who worked at the community hospital across town. David had fixed her car a few months ago when she could not afford the estimate from the big chain shop. She sounded upset, almost panicked. "David, I am so sorry to bother you this late," Rosa said quickly. "But I did not know who else to call. We have a big problem at the hospital and I remembered how you helped me with my car. I know this is not really your thing, but maybe you could help us." David sat up straighter. Rosa was a good person. If she was calling him, it must be important. "What is wrong, Rosa?" David asked. "Our backup generator stopped working," Rosa explained. "The storm knocked out our main power and now the generator will not start. We have patients on life support and a woman who is about to have a baby. The battery backup will not last much longer. We called the regular repair service, but they want $5,000 just to come out tonight, and we do not have that kind of money." David felt his heart sink. $5,000. That was more money than he made in 2 months. He could understand why the hospital could not pay it. "I know you work on cars, not generators," Rosa continued. "But you are so good with engines and electrical stuff. Maybe you could take a look? I know we cannot pay much, but maybe we could work something out." David looked around his shop, at the bills on his desk, at the empty cash box, at the calendar showing rent due in 2 days. The smart thing would be to say no. He had his own problems. He could not afford to work for free, especially not on something he had never worked on before. But then he thought about the patients Rosa mentioned. People on life support, a woman having a baby, people who needed help right now, people who could not wait until morning or until someone found $5,000. David had never worked on a hospital generator before. He did not even know if he could fix it. But he knew engines. He knew electrical systems. Most importantly, he knew that sometimes you had to try, even when you were not sure you could succeed. "I will be right there," David said. David grabbed his toolbox without thinking twice. His hands moved on their own, collecting wrenches, screwdrivers, and electrical testing equipment. He had no idea if these tools would help with a hospital generator, but they were all he had. His heart was beating fast as he threw everything into the back of his old pickup truck. The rain was coming down harder now. The windshield wipers on his truck squeaked with every swipe, barely keeping up with the water. David drove through the empty streets, his mind racing. What did he know about generators? They were like car engines in some ways. They had electrical systems, moving parts, fuel systems. Maybe his 15 years of fixing cars would be enough. Maybe not. But he had to try. The community hospital sat on the edge of town, a plain brick building that looked tired even on good days. Tonight it looked almost scary. Most of the windows were dark with only a few rooms showing the dim glow of emergency lighting. David parked his truck near the emergency entrance and ran through the rain, his toolbox banging against his leg. Inside, the hospital felt different. The usual bright lights were gone, replaced by the pale yellow glow of battery-powered emergency lights. The normal sounds of a busy hospital were missing too. No humming air conditioning, no background noise from all the electronic equipment that usually filled every room. Instead, there was a tense quiet that made David's stomach tighten. Rosa met him at the entrance. She looked exhausted, her nurse uniform wrinkled from a long day that had just gotten much longer. But her face showed relief when she saw David. "Thank you. You for coming," she said, leading him quickly down a hallway. "I know this is not what you usually do, but we are desperate. Dr. Martinez is with the patients upstairs, trying to keep everyone stable. We have maybe 2 hours of battery power left, and then—" She did not finish the sentence, but David understood. After 2 hours, the medical equipment would stop working. People would die. They walked down a staircase to the basement. The emergency. Lighting was dimmer down here, creating long shadows that moved as they walked. The air was warmer and smelled like oil and metal. At the end of a narrow hallway, Rosa opened a heavy door marked "Generator Room, Authorized Personnel Only." The generator was huge, much bigger than David had expected. It sat in the middle of the room like a sleeping giant, all metal and wires and complicated parts he had never seen before. The silence from the machine was overwhelming. This thing was supposed to be running, supposed to be saving lives, but instead it just sat there, useless. "It stopped about 3 hours ago," Rosa explained. "Right when the main power went out. The maintenance guy tried to start it manually, but nothing happened. We called our usual repair service, but they said it would cost $5,000 just to send someone out tonight." David set down his toolbox and walked around the generator slowly. It was intimidating, but he forced himself to stay calm. Every machine had a logic to it, every problem had a cause, he just had to find it. "Do you have any manuals for this thing?" David asked. Rosa shook her head. "The maintenance guy took all the paperwork when he quit last month. Budget cuts, you know. We have been trying to handle repairs ourselves." David nodded. He understood budget cuts. He lived with them every day. He pulled out his flashlight and started looking at the generator more carefully. It was old, probably 15 years or more, but it looked well maintained. Someone had taken care of it over the years. He found the control panel on one side. Lots of switches, gauges, and warning lights. Some of the lights were blinking red, which was not a good sign. David studied the panel, trying to understand what each light meant. It was like learning a new language, but he had done that before with different car models. "Can you tell me exactly what happened when it stopped?" David asked. Rosa thought for a moment. "The lights went out upstairs first, then the generator started automatically, like it always does. But after maybe 10 minutes, it just died. No. Warning, no strange noises. It just stopped." David opened his toolbox and pulled out his electrical tester. If the generator had been running and then stopped suddenly, it was probably an electrical problem. He started checking connections, following wires, testing circuits. The work was slow and careful. One wrong move could make things worse. After 30 minutes, David found the first clue. Several electrical connections were corroded, green with age and moisture. The basement was damp, and over the years, the moisture had eaten away at the metal connections. When the generator tried to handle the full electrical load of the hospital, these weak connections had failed. But that was not the only problem. As David dug deeper into the electrical system, he found that a main fuse had blown. This fuse was bigger than any he had ever seen, designed to handle the massive electrical current that a hospital needed. Without this fuse, the generator could not deliver power even if everything else worked perfectly. David sat back on his heels and wiped sweat from his face. The basement was getting warmer, and the work was making him hot. He looked at his watch. He had been working for over an hour. That meant less than 1 hour of battery power left upstairs. The corroded connections he could fix, He had wire brushes and electrical cleaner in his truck, but the blown fuse was a bigger problem. He needed an exact replacement, and he doubted any auto parts store would have something this specialized, especially not at 9 o'clock at night. David thought about the fuses in his shop. He had collected all kinds of electrical parts over the years, stuff that customers left behind or parts he bought in bulk to save money. Maybe, just maybe, he had something that would work. "I need to get something from my truck," David told Rosa. "This is going to take some creative thinking." Outside, the rain had slowed to a steady drizzle. David dug through the boxes of parts in the back of his truck, using his flashlight to search through years of collected electrical components, fuses, relays, switches, wire connectors. Most of it was for cars, but electricity was electricity. The principles were the same. He found what he was looking for in an old box he had almost forgotten about. 3 large fuses from a commercial truck he had worked on years ago. They were not exactly the same as the hospital fuse, but they were close. Close enough that they might work, at least temporarily. Back in the generator room, David got to work. He cleaned the corroded connections first, scraping away years of green buildup and coating everything with electrical contact cleaner. The connections looked much better, bright and clean and ready to carry electricity again. The fuse replacement was trickier. David had to modify the mounting brackets to make the truck fuses fit in the hospital generator. It was not pretty, but it was functional. He used electrical tape and wire nuts to make sure all the connections were secure. As he worked, Rosa stayed with him, holding the flashlight and handing him tools. She asked questions about what he was doing, and David found himself explaining the work. It helped him think through each step, and it seemed to calm Rosa's nerves. "You really think this will work?" Rosa asked as David made the final connections. "I think it has a good chance," David said honestly. "The generator is in good shape overall. It just needed some maintenance that got put off too long. These temporary fixes should get you through tonight, but you will need proper parts soon." David stood up and looked at the control panel. Everything looked ready. All the connections were clean and tight. The makeshift fuses were installed properly, but there was only one way to find out if it would work. "Cross your fingers," David said, and pressed the start button. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the generator coughed like a car engine on a cold morning. It coughed again, then started to rumble. The rumble got louder and steadier, and suddenly the machine came to life with a deep, powerful hum that filled the room. The control panel lit up with green lights. The red warning lights went out one by one. David watched the gauges climb to normal operating levels. Oil pressure good, temperature normal. Electrical output steady and strong. Rosa let out a cry of relief and hugged David without thinking. "You did it. You actually did it." Above them, they could hear the hospital coming back to life. Air conditioning units started humming. Equipment beeped as it powered back on. Lights flickered and then stayed on, bright and steady. Dr. Martinez appeared in the doorway, still wearing surgical scrubs. He was a small man with tired eyes, but those eyes were bright with gratitude now. "The equipment is all running again," he said to David. "The patient in room 302 was down to 5 minutes of battery power on his ventilator. The woman in labor is stable, and we can use all our equipment now. You saved lives tonight." David felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the hot basement. This was why he became a mechanic. Not for the money, though he needed that. Not for the recognition, though this felt good. He did it for moments like this when his skills could make a real difference in people's lives. Dr. Martinez tried to talk about payment, but David waved him off. He knew the hospital's financial situation. Besides, how do you put a price on saving lives? "Just take care of people," David said, packing up his tools. "That is payment enough." As David drove home through the quiet streets, he felt tired but satisfied. His own problems would still be there tomorrow. The bills, the rent, the struggling business. But tonight he had done something that mattered. Tonight he had been exactly where he needed to be. David drove home through the empty streets, his body aching from hours of crawling around the generator room. His clothes were soaked with sweat and stained with oil, and his hands were cut up from working with sharp metal pieces in tight spaces. But despite being exhausted, he felt something he had not felt in months. He felt useful. He felt like he had made a real difference. The clock on his truck dashboard showed 2 in the morning when he finally pulled into the narrow alley behind his shop. The rain had stopped, but the streets were still wet and shiny under the streetlights. David parked his truck and sat there for a moment, just breathing. His toolbox sat in the passenger seat, still smelling like the hospital basement. He climbed the narrow stairs to his small apartment above the shop. It was not much, just a bedroom, a tiny kitchen, and a living room with a couch that had seen better days. But it was home, and tonight, it felt especially welcoming. David took a quick shower, washing off the grease and sweat from the night's work. The hot water felt amazing on his sore muscles. Before going to bed, David looked out his bedroom window at his shop below. The old building looked the same as always. Paint peeling, sign flickering, windows that needed cleaning. Tomorrow, he would have to face the same problems. The bills on his desk, the empty cash box, the rent that was due in 2 days. But somehow those problems seemed a little smaller now. David fell asleep as soon as his head hit the pillow. For the first time in weeks, he did not lie awake worrying about money or wondering how long he could keep his shop open. Instead, he slept deeply. The kind of sleep that comes after doing something important and meaningful. He was dreaming about fixing cars when a strange sound woke him up. It was still morning, but the sun was already high in the sky. David looked at his alarm clock and was surprised to see it was almost 10 o'clock. He had slept longer than he had in months. The sound that woke him was not familiar. It was the low, smooth hum of an expensive engine, but not like any car that usually came down his street. David's neighborhood was full of old cars, pickup trucks, and minivans held together with hope and duct tape. This sound was different. This was the purr of something expensive, something that did not belong in his part of town. David got up and walked to his window. What he saw made him rub his eyes, thinking he might still be dreaming. Parked right in front of his shop was a long black car unlike anything he had ever seen in person. It was a limousine, and not just any limousine. This was the kind of car that rich people rode in, with perfect paint that reflected the morning sun and chrome that sparkled like jewelry. The car looked completely out of place on Pine Street. It was like seeing a racehorse in a barnyard, or finding a diamond ring in a box of old nuts and bolts. David had seen cars like this in movies, but never in real life, and certainly never on his street. A man in a dark suit and cap stood beside the car. He was clearly the driver, and he looked as professional and polished as the car itself. His uniform was perfectly pressed, his shoes were shined, and he stood with the kind of posture that came from years of military service or high-end employment. David pulled on yesterday's clothes, which still smelled like oil in the hospital basement. He ran his fingers through his hair, trying to make himself look presentable, but there was only so much he could do. He was a mechanic, not a businessman, and he looked like what he was. As David walked down the stairs to his shop, his mind raced with possibilities. Maybe the limousine was lost. Maybe the driver needed directions to the fancy part of town. Maybe there was some kind of mistake. Rich people did not come to his neighborhood, and they certainly did not come looking for him. David opened the front door of his shop and stepped outside. The morning air was fresh and clean after the night's rain, and the sun felt warm on his face. The limousine was even more impressive up close. It was longer than his entire shop was wide, and it probably cost more than he would make in 10 years. "You?" Driver noticed David and nodded politely. "Good morning, sir. Are you David Rodriguez?" "That's me," David said, still confused about what was happening. "Is there something I can help you with?" The driver did not answer directly. Instead, he walked to the back of the limousine and opened the door. The door was heavy and solid, and it opened with the kind of quiet click that only expensive things make. "Mr. Rodriguez," the driver said formally, "someone would like to speak with you." David approached the open door cautiously. The interior of the limousine was like stepping into another world. The seats were covered in leather so soft it looked like butter, and everything inside was polished wood and gleaming metal. The air conditioning created a cool, comfortable environment that was completely different from the warm morning outside. Sitting in the back seat was an elderly man who commanded attention without saying a word. He was probably in his 70s, with silver hair that was perfectly styled and clothes that probably cost more than David's truck. His suit was dark blue and perfectly tailored, and his shoes were polished to a mirror shine. But it was his eyes that caught David's attention. They were sharp and intelligent, the eyes of someone who had spent a lifetime making important decisions. "Mr. Rodriguez," the man said in a voice that was used to being listened to. "My name is Robert Hartwell. I believe we need to talk. Please, get in." David hesitated for a moment. This was all very strange, and he was not sure what was happening. But something about the man's manner made David trust him. This was not someone who meant harm. This was someone who was used to getting what he wanted, but who did it with dignity and respect. David slid into the limousine, and the driver closed the door behind him. The interior was even more impressive than it had looked from outside. The seats were incredibly comfortable, and the ride was so smooth that David could barely feel the car moving. It was like floating on a cloud. "I'm sorry for the dramatic entrance," Robert Hartwell said with a slight smile, "but I wanted to meet you in person, and I thought this might get your attention." "It definitely got my attention," David said, looking around at the luxury surrounding him. "But I'm not sure why you want to meet me. I'm just a mechanic." "Just a mechanic," Hartwell repeated thoughtfully. "Mr. Rodriguez, I have spent 50 years in business, and I have learned that a person's job title does not define their character. What defines character is what someone does when no one is watching, when there is no reward, when helping others costs them something they cannot afford to give." David was completely confused now. "I'm sorry, Mr. Hartwell, but I don't understand what you're talking about." Hartwell reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He handed it to David, who unfolded it carefully. It was a printout of a news article from the local newspaper's website. The headline read, "Local Mechanic Saves Hospital During Power Outage." David stared at the article in surprise. He had no idea that anyone had written about what happened at the hospital. The article was short, but it told the basic story of how he had fixed the generator and refused payment. "How did you find out about this?" David asked. "Dr. Martinez called the newspaper this morning," Hartwell explained. "He wanted people to know what you did. The article went online an hour ago, and it caught my attention for a very personal reason." The limousine was moving now, gliding smoothly through the city streets. David could see his neighborhood passing by outside the tinted windows, but from inside the car, everything looked different. The luxury of the limousine made the outside world seem far away. "You see, Mr. Rodriguez," Hartwell continued, "one of the patients whose life you saved last night was my granddaughter. She's 8 years old, and she was rushed to the hospital during the storm with a severe allergic reaction. Her regular hospital was overwhelmed, so the ambulance took her to the community hospital." David felt his stomach drop. He had not thought about the individual patients when he was working on the generator. He had just focused on getting the machine running, but now he realized that real people, including this man's granddaughter, had been depending on him. "Is she okay?" David asked. "She's fine now, thanks to you," Hartwell said, and for the first time, his composed manner cracked slightly. David could see the emotion in the older man's eyes. "When the power went out and the generator failed, her condition became critical. The doctors said that without the equipment you got running, she might not have made it through the night." David did not know what to say. He had gone to the hospital to help, but he had not fully understood how important his work would be. Knowing that he had saved the life of this man's granddaughter made everything feel different. "I've spent the morning learning about you, Mr. Rodriguez," Hartwell continued. "I know about your reputation in the neighborhood. I know how you treat your customers fairly, how you help people who can't afford to pay full price, how you've kept your shop open even when it would be easier to give up and work for someone else." The limousine turned onto a street David had never been on before. The buildings here were taller and newer, made of glass and steel instead of brick and wood. This was the business district, where people in suits made decisions that affected thousands of other people. "Character like yours is rare, Mr. Rodriguez," Hartwell said. "In my experience, when you find someone with real integrity, Someone who does the right thing without expecting anything in return. You don't let that person slip away. You find a way to work with them. David was starting to understand that this conversation was leading somewhere important, but he could not imagine what someone like Robert Hartwell would want with someone like him. They were from completely different worlds. The limousine pulled up to a tall building made of glass and steel that reached toward the sky like a shining tower. David had driven past this building many times, but he had never imagined he would ever go inside. A sign near the front entrance read, Hartwell Industries, Corporate Headquarters. The letters were made of polished metal and looked expensive, just like everything else about this place. This is my company, Robert Hartwell said, as the driver opened the door for them. I started it 40 years ago in a garage not much bigger than your shop. Today we make medical equipment that helps hospitals all over the country. David followed Hartwell through the impressive lobby. Everything was marble and glass, with paintings on the walls that probably cost more than David's entire shop. People, in expensive business suits, walked quickly across the polished floor, carrying briefcases and talking on phones. They all looked important and busy, like they had somewhere urgent to be. But what struck David most was how everyone greeted Hartwell, not with fear or nervousness, but with genuine respect and warmth. The security guard smiled and said, "Good morning." The woman at the reception desk asked about his granddaughter. The man waiting for the elevator asked about his golf game. This was not a boss who ruled through intimidation. This was a leader who had earned the loyalty of his people. They rode the elevator to the top floor, and David watched the numbers climb higher than he had ever been in a building. When the doors opened, they stepped into an office that was bigger than David's entire apartment. One wall was made entirely of windows, offering a view of the whole city spread out below. "Please sit down," Hartwell said, gesturing to a leather chair that looked more comfortable than David's bed. "Can I get you some coffee, water?" "Coffee would be great," David said. He was trying to act normal, but nothing about this situation felt normal. Yesterday he had been a struggling mechanic worried about paying his rent. Today he was sitting in a millionaire's office, looking out at the city from higher than the birds flew. Hartwell poured coffee from an expensive-looking machine into cups that were probably worth more than David made in a week. The coffee tasted better than any David had ever had, rich and smooth without the bitter edge of the cheap stuff he usually drank. "Let me tell you about my granddaughter," Hartwell said, settling into the chair across from David. "Her name is Katie, and she's the light of my life. 8 years old, full of energy and curiosity. She wants to be a doctor when she grows up, just like the ones who took care of her last night." Hartwell pulled out his phone and showed David a picture. Katie was a beautiful little girl with bright eyes and a huge smile. She was wearing a baseball uniform and holding a trophy, looking proud and happy. She was at a sleepover with her friends when the allergic reaction started, Hartwell continued. "None of us knew she was allergic to shellfish. The reaction was severe and fast. The ambulance rushed her to the nearest hospital, which happened to be the community hospital where you worked last night." David looked at the picture again, trying to imagine this happy little girl fighting for her life in a hospital bed. It made his chest feel tight. When the power went out and the generator failed, Katie was on a ventilator, Hartwell said quietly. "The doctors told me later that she had maybe 10 minutes of battery power left when you got the generator running. Again. 10 minutes, Mr. Rodriguez. That's how close we came to losing her." David set down his coffee cup because his hands were shaking slightly. He had known his work was important, but hearing the specific details made it real in a way that hit him deep in his heart. "But that's not the end of the story," Hartwell continued. "This morning, when Dr. Martinez called to tell me Katie was going to be fine, he also told me about you, about how you came in the middle of the night, worked for hours in a hot basement, fixed equipment you had never seen before, and then refused to take any payment." Hartwell stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city below. "Dr. Martinez also told me about your reputation in the community, how you help people who can't afford full-price repairs, how you let customers pay in installments when they're struggling, how you've kept your shop open in a neighborhood where other businesses have closed." David did not know what to say. He had never thought of himself as special. He just did what felt right. I've been in business for 4 decades, Hartwell said, turning back to face David. I've met thousands of people, worked with hundreds of companies, made deals worth millions of dollars. But I've learned that success in business isn't just about money or profits. It's about finding people you can trust, people who share your values, people who do the right thing even when no one is watching. Hartwell returned to his chair and leaned forward, his eyes serious and focused. I want to offer you an opportunity, Mr. Rodriguez. My company makes medical equipment, but we've had a problem for years. We sell our equipment to hospitals all over the country, but when that equipment breaks down, hospitals often can't afford the repair costs, especially smaller hospitals in communities like yours. David was starting to understand where this conversation might be heading, but he couldn't quite believe it. We've been looking for someone to head up a new division of our company, Hartwell continued. Someone who understands both the technical side of equipment repair and the human side of helping communities that don't have much money. Someone with the skills to fix complex medical equipment and the heart to help people who need it most. Hartwell pulled out a folder from his desk and set it in front of David. This position would involve traveling to hospitals like the one where you worked last night. You would fix their equipment, train their staff, and help them maintain their systems. You would be helping to save lives every day, just like you did last night. David opened the folder and saw papers covered with numbers that made his eyes go wide. The salary being offered was more money than he had ever imagined making, more than enough to solve all his financial problems and still have plenty left over. But that's not all, Hartwell said with a smile. I also want to invest in your auto repair business. Your neighborhood needs someone like you, someone who treats people fairly and helps when times are tough. I want to provide the capital to modernize your shop, buy new equipment, maybe even expand to a bigger location. David stared at the papers, trying to process what he was hearing. This morning he had woken up worried about paying his rent. Now, he was being offered opportunities that would change his entire life. I don't understand, David said slowly. Why me? You could hire anyone for this job. People with college degrees, people with experience in medical equipment, people who know your industry. Hartwell laughed, a warm sound that filled the big office. Mr. Rodriguez, let me tell you something I've learned in 40 years of business. Technical skills can be taught. Experience can be gained. But character, integrity, the willingness to help others even when it costs you something you can't afford to give, that can't be taught. That's something you either have or you don't, and you have it. David looked out the window at the city spread below. Somewhere down there was his little shop, with its peeling paint and flickering sign. Somewhere down there were his customers, people who depended on him to keep their cars running so they could get to work, take their kids to school, visit sick relatives. What about my customers? David asked. The people in my neighborhood who need someone they can trust? That's exactly why I want to invest in your shop, Hartwell said. You'll have the resources to serve them even better. New equipment, better facilities, maybe even the ability to hire some help so you can take on more customers. Your neighborhood needs you, but imagine how much more you could help them with proper resources. David thought about Mrs. Johnson with her old Honda, about Robert the taxi driver with his 3 kids, about Helen the elderly lady who brought him cookies. They were more than customers. They were his community, his family. You don't have to give me an answer today, Hartwell said gently. This is a big decision, and you should take time to think about it. But I hope you'll seriously consider it. My granddaughter is alive today because you were willing to help when others wouldn't. Now I want to help you, and through you, help many more people. As they rode back down in the elevator, David's mind was spinning. This morning, he had been a struggling mechanic facing eviction. Now he was being offered opportunities that seemed too good to be true. But looking at Robert Hartwell, David could see this was not some elaborate joke or mistake. This was real. The limousine ride back to David's shop passed in a blur. Hartwell gave David his personal phone number and told him to call with any questions. As the car pulled up to the familiar sight of David's shop, the contrast was almost funny. The gleaming limousine looked even more out of place now. like a spaceship that had landed in the wrong century. "Think about it, Mr. Rodriguez," Hartwell said as David got out of the car. "Sometimes life has a way of rewarding those who give selflessly to others. Last night you saved my granddaughter's life without knowing who she was or expecting anything in return. Today, I want to return that kindness by giving you the chance to save many more lives." As the limousine drove away, David stood in front of his shop and looked at it with new eyes. The peeling paint, the flickering sign, the narrow alley, the stack of bills on his desk, all of it looked different now. Not like problems that were crushing him, but like challenges that could be overcome. David walked into his shop and sat down at his desk. He looked at the thank you cards on his wall, the pictures from customers, the drawing from little Annie. These people had trusted him, and he had never let them down. Now he had a chance to help not just them, but people all over the country. He thought about Katie, the little girl whose life he had saved without even knowing it. He thought about all the other patients in hospitals everywhere who might need someone like him to keep their equipment running. He thought about his own dreams of making a real difference in the world. David picked up the phone and dialed the number on Robert Hartwell's business card. When the familiar voice answered, David took a deep breath. "Mr. Hartwell," he said, "I'd like to accept your offer.